If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. The night in the frontier village had been quiet except for the dogs barking and the shuffle of feet when the decision was carried out. A woman, no more than 25, was dragged from her hut by her neighbors. She had lived all her life among them, but her marriage had brought no children, and whispers had grown louder with each passing season. In a world where survival depended on new hands to tend fields and fight in wars, her barrenness became a sentence. Some called it a curse from the gods. Others said she brought misfortune to the crops. She pleaded, but her words carried no weight. That night, they carried her to the edge of the settlement, forced her into the ground they had dug, and shoveled dirt over her trembling body until her cries faded under the soil. She lay there, pinned by the weight of the earth pressing against her chest, panic clawing at her lungs. Every breath came as a struggle, the soil filtering the air until each gasp burned. Her mind ran to memories of when she was a child, laughing among olive trees, of her mother's voice calling her inside. She thought of the husband who had once defended her, then grew cold as the village turned against them both. Her fears sharpened into despair. No one would come. She would die with her eyes wide open, staring at the darkness closing in. By dawn, the settlement was still. The people had returned to their huts, believing their misfortune buried with her. The road that passed nearby was almost empty, but one man came along it. Marcus, a legionary of Rome, walked with a soldier's pace, steady and controlled, his armor dulled by years of dust and battle. He had fought for over a decade on distant borders, against tribes along the Danube, rebels in the east and raiders in the north. His duty had been to kill and endure, but when his campaign ended, he chose not to return to the city. Instead, he remained on the frontier, detached from both Rome and the people he protected. His years in the Legion had given him scars on his body and a silence in his soul. Each step was measured, his hand always near the hilt of his gladius, though no enemy followed him now. As he passed the village, something caught his attention. The ground uneven, disturbed, too fresh to be an animal's doing. He stopped. At first he thought of graves, for war had made him familiar with the smell and sight of death. But then he noticed a faint tremor, almost hidden under the shifting soil. He crouched, pressed his palm to the earth, and felt the weak, irregular movement beneath. His jaw tightened. In his mind, he weighed the possibilities. Perhaps it was nothing, only loose soil. Or perhaps the villagers had buried someone. He knew enough of frontier customs to guess why. His first instinct was to walk on. It was not his affair, and a soldier's life had trained him not to carry burdens that were not ordered. Yet something in the weak persistence of the movement drew him back. He thought of the comrades he had once seen buried alive when a siege wall collapsed, their muffled cries still echoing years later in his memory. He could not leave this earth undisturbed. He drew his short blade and cut into the dirt, moving with calm precision. His fingers dug through the soil, pulling it away until his hand closed around a wrist, frail and trembling. He pulled harder, clearing the dirt from a face smeared with earth and tears. Her eyes fluttered open, wild with terror, her lips moving but no sound escaping. Marcus did not speak. He did not scold her, nor call out to the villagers. He knew their judgment had already been cast. Instead, he dug until her chest was free, lifted her from the grave, and held her against him. She was limp, nearly broken, her breath shallow. In that moment, Marcus felt the weight of decision press upon him, whether to leave her or to take responsibility for her survival. His body, worn by years of war, chose without hesitation. He carried her away from the mound, his stride steady, his eyes set toward the small shelter he had built beyond the fort's edge. As the morning sun rose, the village behind them returned to its routine, unaware that the woman they had condemned still breathed. Marcus did not look back. He knew he could not change them, but he could carry her forward. Marcus carried the woman along the narrow path that ran beside the palisade, his arms firm beneath her frail body. She had no strength to resist, but her eyes flickered open at intervals, searching his face as though to understand why he had pulled her from the earth when her own people had chosen to bury her. He did not speak, but his grip was steady, and his gaze did not wander. The small shelter he kept lay half a mile beyond the fort. A modest structure of wood and stone meant less for comfort than for solitude. It had been his refuge since his discharge from the Legion, a place where he could rest away from the demands of commanders and the suspicions of villagers who never quite trusted soldiers who stayed after their service ended. Inside, the single room smelled of smoke and iron oil. A cot of straw, a wooden chest, a small table with rough clay cups, and a hearth of blackened stones filled the space. It was not the home of a family man, but of one accustomed to living alone. Marcus laid her gently on the cot and brought water from a jar, tipping it against her lips. At first she coughed, soil still lodged in her throat, but he waited and tried again until she managed to swallow. Her hands trembled as she clutched the rim of the cup, though she could not lift it without his help. Her breathing slowed, though the fear remained in her eyes. Marcus crouched beside her, studying her face in the firelight. She was younger than he had first thought, perhaps in her mid-20s, though her features carried the lines of someone who had worked hard in the fields. Her cheeks were sunken, her lips dry, and the dirt embedded in her hair gave her the look of someone who had been abandoned not only in body but in spirit. He could guess why. Villages like this one clung to survival by strict rules. Every woman judged by her ability to bear children, every man judged by his ability to defend or labor. Those who failed were cast aside. Marcus had seen it before in towns from Gaul to Syria. What he had not expected was to find it on this morning, waiting under a mound of earth. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked into silence. Her throat had been too damaged by soil and suffocation. Marcus raised his hand slightly, a simple gesture for her to rest, and for the first time she seemed to understand he was not there to harm her. Her shoulders eased against the cot. He rose, set a pan over the fire, and boiled water with a handful of dried herbs he kept from the last campaign. He poured it into a cup and placed it near her, nodding for her to drink. As she sipped, her eyes remained fixed on him. There was confusion, fear, but also something sharper, a question she could not voice but one that hung in the silence between them. Why had he chosen to intervene? Marcus felt the weight of it, though she said nothing. He had no simple answer. Only the memory of comrades gasping for air beneath collapsed earth, and his own disgust at the thought of walking past without acting. To her, this explanation would mean little. So he remained silent, his only answer found in the way he stayed near, his presence steady as the fire crackled. The hours passed with little movement. She drifted in and out of sleep, her body shaking as it tried to recover. Each time she stirred, Marcus was there, sometimes sitting at the table sharpening his blade, sometimes stacking firewood against the wall, sometimes simply seated beside the cot. He made no attempt to question her, for he understood enough of shame and betrayal to know that forcing words too soon would break what little strength she had left. For her part, she studied him when she thought he would not notice. His armor bore dents and scratches from long service, and his forearms were crisscrossed with scars. His eyes carried a weary calm, not cruel but guarded, the eyes of a man who had seen more death than life. She wondered if he meant to keep her or send her away once she was strong enough to walk. Fear rose at the thought of being cast out again, but exhaustion dulled her mind before she could dwell on it. By nightfall, a storm rolled over the plains. Rain struck the roof of the shelter, the sound heavy and unbroken. Marcus placed another log on the fire, then set a woolen cloak across her body. The simple act startled her. No one had touched her with such care since before the villagers had turned against her. She blinked hard, fighting back tears, and turned her face toward the wall so he would not see. For Marcus, the decision to keep her alive had already been made. The question now was what it would mean for him, for her, and for the fragile order of the frontier. He had chosen solitude after the Legion because solitude carried no demands. Yet with this woman lying in his shelter, her breath steady but fragile, he knew that solitude was already gone. The second chapter closes here with new clarity: who she was, why she had been buried, and why he, scarred by war but unwilling to let her die, had acted. What began as an instinct had become something neither of them yet understood but could no longer ignore. The storm passed by morning, leaving the earth heavy with mud and the air filled with the smell of wet wood. Inside the shelter, the fire had burned low, but Marcus kept it alive through the night, adding small logs whenever the crackle began to fade. The woman woke slowly, her eyes opening to the dim light that crept in through the narrow doorway. For the first time since he had lifted her from the grave, she looked around the room with some measure of awareness rather than pure fear. The cot she lay on was simple but clean, the blanket coarse but warm. Her throat ached, but she managed to whisper a sound that almost formed into words. Marcus, seated nearby with his whetstone pressed against the edge of his blade, turned his head slightly, listening. Her lips parted again. This time a broken question escaped, little more than a rasp. Why? Her voice cracked, but the meaning was clear. She wanted to know why he had saved her when her own people had chosen death for her. Marcus did not answer at once. He set the blade aside, rested his elbows on his knees, and regarded her in silence. He thought of explaining that he had seen too many people buried in haste, that he could not let the earth close over someone still breathing. Yet he also knew that words were fragile, easily mistrusted. Instead, he gave a small shake of his head, as if to dismiss the question, and pushed the cup of water toward her once more. She drank, though her eyes never left his. To the listener who might wonder, who exactly was she, and why had her village condemned her? Her mind now began to fill the gaps. She was the daughter of a farmer, married young, expected to give her husband children that would one day work the fields. 2 years had passed, then 3 without pregnancy. Her husband had first defended her, then grown cold as whispers spread. When the harvest failed, blame fell on her shoulders. By the time the council of elders declared her cursed, her husband did not raise his voice against it. Her name, which once carried meaning in her family, was now spoken only in shame. She told none of this aloud, but the fragments passed through her thoughts as she lay there, staring at the man who had undone the burial chosen for her. Marcus studied her in return. He had wondered during the night whether she might try to flee back to her people once she regained strength. But he understood from her eyes that there was no home left for her. She carried the weight of abandonment as plainly as he carried the scars on his arms. In her broken voice and in the hollow set of her shoulders, he recognized something familiar: disgrace without justice, exile without crime. He had lived long enough under commanders who treated men like tools to know what it meant to be discarded once no longer useful. The difference was that he had chosen isolation, while she had been forced into it. As the hours passed, she gained enough strength to sit up. Marcus placed a bowl of barley porridge before her. Her hands shook as she lifted the spoon, but she forced herself to eat. He said nothing, watching only to see if her body could handle food again. When she had finished half the bowl, he set it aside and returned to his seat by the fire. Silence stretched between them. It was not hostile. She no longer feared he would harm her, though uncertainty remained about what role she now held in his life: guest, burden, or something undefined. Outside, the village could be heard faintly in the distance, its noise carried by the damp air. The calls of shepherds, the creak of wagons, the voices of children. The sounds made her tense. She knew if they discovered she still lived, punishment would come swiftly not only for her, but for the man who had taken her in. Marcus noticed the way her body stiffened at the noises and quietly moved to close the wooden door, muting the world beyond. The small gesture calmed her. As night fell again, she shifted beneath the blanket and whispered her name. It was the first time she had offered it since her rescue. Marcus nodded once, accepting it without reply. He did not tell her his name in return, not out of cruelty, but habit. For years in the Legion, names had mattered little. Men died too quickly to bind meaning to them. Yet after a long pause, as though the act required effort, he finally said, "Marcus." She repeated it softly, testing the sound, as if speaking it aloud gave her something solid to hold on to. For the listener who might wonder what bound them in that moment, it was not love, nor even trust, but the recognition of survival. Both had been left behind, he by the army that no longer needed him, she by the village that had condemned her. In the flicker of firelight, they did not speak of the past, but the silence between them began to carry weight of its own, heavy yet strangely steady. When she closed her eyes to sleep that night, she no longer turned her face toward the wall in fear. And when Marcus laid another log on the fire, he did so with the unspoken decision that she would remain. The following days settled into a rhythm shaped less by words than by necessity. Marcus rose early, as he always had during his years in the Legion, his body trained to respond to the first light. He tended to the fire, checked the small traps he set in the woods, and sharpened his blade though no battle waited for him. When he returned, the woman was usually awake, sitting against the wall of the shelter, her eyes following him cautiously. She had begun to eat more, though each meal was slow, her hands still unsteady. He placed food before her without comment, and she accepted it without question. The silence between them, once tense, grew into something less fragile, an understanding that neither owed the other explanations, at least not yet. For the listener who might wonder about her body's recovery, the progress was uneven. The soil she had swallowed left her with a cough that lingered for days, and her ribs ached where the weight of the earth had pressed against them. Marcus noticed her wincing when she tried to draw deeper breaths. He mixed crushed herbs into her water to ease the pain, the same remedy soldiers used on long campaigns. She drank it without protest, though her eyes studied him, as if trying to understand how a man hardened by war could show such patience in these small acts. When she was strong enough to step outside, he guided her carefully to the edge of the shelter where the ground was firm. The village lay in the distance, its smoke rising against the horizon. She looked at it with visible tension, her jaw tight, her body rigid as if she feared someone might appear and drag her back. Marcus stood beside her, silent but steady, his presence a shield without words. She whispered then, her voice hoarse but clear enough, "They will not forgive me." Marcus gave no reply, yet the set of his expression told her that he had already accepted this truth. He understood exile, understood that there were places one could never return to, no matter the longing. By evening, she began to assist in small ways. She carried wood inside, arranged kindling, and attempted to sweep the floor with a crude broom. Marcus did not stop her, though he noticed how quickly she grew tired. When she faltered, he took over without remark. For the first time since her burial, she felt her hands had purpose again. It steadied her mind, anchoring her to something other than fear. There were questions unspoken that any listener might ask. Would her husband search for her? Would the village discover she lived? The truth was simple. Her husband had already abandoned her in spirit long before the burial, and the village, having convinced itself that the gods demanded her death, had no reason to look for her. In their eyes, she no longer existed. That certainty carried both pain and freedom. She grieved the loss of the life she once imagined, but she also realized she was no longer bound by the rules that had condemned her. At night, as the fire burned low, she watched Marcus more closely. His movements carried the discipline of a soldier, precise and controlled, but when he rested, there was weariness in his shoulders, a heaviness that no blade could cut away. She wondered what battles had shaped him, what losses haunted him in the silence. Once, she asked softly, "Did you have a family?" He looked at her for a long moment before shaking his head. He did not explain further, but the way his gaze drifted to the fire told her the answer was not as simple as no. She chose not to press, sensing that the past he carried was a wound not yet closed. In those days, their silence became a language. When she coughed in the night, Marcus rose without complaint to bring water. When he returned from gathering wood, she had swept the ashes from the hearth. Neither announced these gestures, yet both noticed. Step by step, the weight of strangeness lifted. For Marcus, the presence of another life in his shelter forced him to adjust in ways he had not expected. He had built this place as a fortress of solitude, a way to live apart from commands and obligations. Now he found himself watching her carefully, not out of suspicion, but to measure her strength, to ensure she did not falter. The instinct that had once been for comrades on the battlefield had shifted toward her. By the end of the week, the fear in her eyes had faded, replaced by a quiet resolve. She no longer looked like a woman waiting to die, but like someone testing the idea of living again. Marcus, though still silent, recognized it. When she managed a faint smile as she placed a bowl on the table, he returned it with the smallest nod. It was not much, but for both of them, it marked the beginning of something steady, something fragile but real. The days turned into weeks, and with them the atmosphere inside the shelter shifted from survival to something more measured, more deliberate. The woman, no longer merely a half-buried shadow of herself, had regained her strength enough to walk steadily and carry out simple tasks without trembling. She prepared meals with the few supplies Marcus kept, fetched water from the stream under his watchful eye, and tended the fire while he was away. The cot that once seemed her prison of recovery became just one part of the space she now moved within freely. For Marcus, the change was noticeable not only in her movements but also in her eyes. Fear had given way to attentiveness, then to curiosity, and finally to a quiet determination to contribute, to prove her place in the shelter was not born only of his pity. For the listener who might wonder whether she still carried bitterness toward her village, the answer was complex. At night, when the fire burned low and silence grew heavier, her gaze sometimes drifted toward the direction of the settlement, and her face tightened. She had not forgiven them, but she no longer spoke their name or clung to their memory. She understood now that no plea could ever undo what they had done. In her silence, she chose to bury them as thoroughly as they had buried her. Marcus noticed this unspoken choice, and though he never asked, he respected it, never mentioning the village again. Their daily life began to take on a shape that mirrored family, though neither called it such. Marcus cut wood and repaired the roof beams. She cooked and mended his tunic where the seams had begun to fray. One afternoon, she surprised him by leaving a small piece of cloth she had embroidered, a simple pattern, rough from lack of fine thread, on the table beside his cup. He did not comment, but later she noticed he had tied the cloth around the hilt of his blade. The gesture spoke more than words could. There were practical questions, too, that would trouble an onlooker. How would they live through the coming seasons with such meager supplies? What if the villagers discovered she was alive? Chapter 5 resolves these quietly. Marcus had already chosen to remain distant from the village, trading only when absolutely necessary. His reputation as a soldier kept most people wary, and his solitary nature discouraged questions. If anyone had noticed the faint movement of a woman near his shelter, they had not dared to approach or confront him. As for provisions, Marcus hunted and trapped, while she learned to dry meat and grind barley more efficiently, making the rations last. Together, their survival became sustainable, not merely temporary. The silence between them softened further. It was no longer heavy with distrust, but filled with unspoken understanding. At meals, she sometimes hummed softly, a tune from her childhood. Marcus never asked its meaning, but he listened without interruption, the sound unfamiliar, yet strangely grounding. One evening, she asked him in a quiet tone if he regretted saving her. He looked at her, held her gaze, and shook his head once. She pressed no further, and for the first time since their lives had crossed, she allowed herself to smile openly. For Marcus, the presence of her smile stirred something long absent. He had lived so long in silence, convinced that solitude was the only way to carry the weight of war, that he had forgotten what it meant to share even a simple moment of ease. Yet as she placed bread on the table and looked at him without fear, he felt the edge of that solitude break. He did not show it in words, but his decision was firm. She belonged here as much as he did. By the end of the 5th chapter of their story, the bond between them was no longer survival alone. It had grown into quiet companionship, steady and unquestioned. They were no longer two abandoned souls merely enduring the days. They were shaping a life side by side, unremarkable to the world outside, but stronger than the judgment that had once sought to end her and the wars that had once consumed him. The rains of early spring softened the hard earth around the shelter, washing away the last traces of winter and leaving the air heavy with the smell of wet grass and new growth. It was during these weeks that the woman's recovery became complete. She no longer coughed through the night. Her body had regained its strength, and her steps across the clearing grew steady and sure. For Marcus, the change was undeniable. The fragile, half-buried figure he had once pulled from the ground now stood beside him as someone alive in her own right. For listeners who might wonder whether her presence would always remain hidden, the truth unfolded here. The village did not seek her. To them, she had already been erased, her death marked in their minds as final. No elders came to question Marcus, no husband searched for her, and no voices from the settlement called her name. The decision to cast her out had been absolute, and in that finality, both danger and obligation had passed. She was free, not by their mercy, but by the certainty of their cruelty. Their life together became less about survival and more about belonging. Each morning Marcus trained outside, his movements deliberate as he swung his blade, muscles remembering the patterns of war. She watched at first from the doorway, then began bringing him water, standing nearby, not as an intruder, but as a companion who understood the silence of his routines. In return, he began helping with the tasks she set for herself, carrying buckets of water, mending the roof when she pointed out gaps, planting small herbs she had gathered from the edges of the forest. Their efforts overlapped in a rhythm that no longer felt temporary. It was around the fire one evening that she finally asked the question left unanswered since the first night. "Will you send me away when summer comes?" Her voice was steady, but her hands clenched the edge of her cloak. She needed to know if her place here was only until she was strong enough to live alone. Marcus looked at her for a long time before answering. He shook his head slowly, then said in a low voice that carried the weight of conviction, "You are here now. That is enough." His words were few, but for her, they were more than she had expected. She exhaled, her shoulders easing, and for the first time she allowed her hand to rest on the table beside his. He did not move it away. For listeners who might wonder about his past, whether he carried family somewhere else, the answer became clear in that moment. He had no one waiting for him, no wife in Rome, no children in another province. The Legion had been his only life, and when that ended, so too had the ties that might have pulled him back. She understood then that his silence was not rejection, but the mark of years lived in duty, years that had cost him the simple closeness of another human being. She did not pity him. Instead, she felt the quiet relief of knowing they both carried scars that could be tended only by staying, not by speaking. By late spring, their routines merged completely. She baked bread while he gathered wood. He sharpened blades while she prepared herbs, and in the evenings they shared their meal without need for words. Yet the silence no longer felt like a void. It was full with the presence of two people who had been abandoned by others, but refused to abandon each other. Her laughter began to return in short bursts, once when he spilled water clumsily over his arm, another time when the wind blew smoke into his eyes as he tended the fire. Each time, Marcus looked at her with a stillness that carried more than amusement. There was recognition in his gaze, as if these small sounds were proof that life had truly begun again for both of them. The story closed one morning when they stood together outside the shelter, watching the sun rise over the horizon. The fields glistened with dew, the air alive with birdsong. She placed her hand over his, not timidly, but with certainty. Marcus did not pull away. His grip tightened around hers, a simple act, but one that made clear what words could not. They would remain together, not as soldier and burden, not as outcast and savior, but as two lives rebuilt in the quiet safety of belonging. For the listener who might ask if happiness was possible after all they had endured, the answer lay in that silence at dawn. They had no need for vows, no need for the approval of others. Their family was made not by birth, nor by decree, but by the steady act of staying. The past no longer pursued them. The future no longer frightened them. Together, they had found what the world had once denied them: peace. And so their story ended here, complete, resolved, and unbroken.